Welcome to Problem Solvers, Episode 2, a show highlighting real-world supply chain challenges and amazing and brilliant people overcoming those challenges for the benefit of us all. I am Ben Banks, President and CEO of BNSF Logistics, coming to you from the Cave at Lube Mink Drive in Fort Worth, Texas. I've spent or endured, depending on the week, 18 years in supply chain. I've seen a lot, I've done a lot, but still feel like a rookie compared to my guest. Today's guest lives up to that assertion, as he definitely makes me question what I've been doing for the last 18 years. Martin Liu, the mad scientist behind Commtrex, the Angie's List of sorts for moving our goods from where they are to where they need to be via the most environmentally friendly mode possible, rail. But we're going to talk a little bit about 2.0 as well, broadening that scope a bit. Welcome, Martin. Thanks for coming. So let's just start out just you a little bit. Tell us a little bit about you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. Excited to be here. Problem Solvers, by the way, is a great name for this because ultimately, as logisticians, I feel like our life is all about solving problems. So couldn't have a more appropriate name. So just a background on me. My first sort of profession that I sort of went into before starting Commtrex was investment banking, commodities trading. Out of law school, I knew I didn't want to be a corporate securities lawyer, so I decided to go into investment banking and worked at Bear Stearns on their environmental markets and coal trading desk. They were starting an energy trading group in Houston, and shortly thereafter, the financial crisis happened. JP Morgan acquires Bear Stearns. Ended up staying with JP Morgan for another about 7 years, leading origination for their coal and environmental markets group. Had no idea that I would eventually end up trying to build a platform that connects all rail server locations. But moving several million tons of coal per year, I was not on the logistics team. I was on the commercial side of the business, putting together the different deals with the coal mines and the utilities and shippers. And really the concept was, how do you find the best arbitrage opportunity for the different types of coal that we're moving, whether it be Central Appalachian coal, Illinois Basin coal, Colorado Uinta coal, or PRB. And what I found while doing that was there were several blind spots within the rail supply chain or within rail logistics that made it very difficult for us to be able to move quickly. And in the game of trading, particularly sales and trading in the bank side, the two really competitive advantages that you have are really two things: information and insight, and the ability to be able to move quickly. Obviously, the balance sheet, that goes without saying that you need a balance sheet to be able to execute a lot of these different arbitrage opportunities. But when thinking about the real competitive advantage you have, it's, where can you find fragmentation or dislocation in these different industries? And as a trader on the coal desk, it was always very difficult for us to be able to find rail cars if we needed rail cars quickly, if we needed to find a terminal, a port, a translo facility, if we needed to store cars. Even just to get a basic rate was difficult. So after hearing these complaints and, obviously having a lot of friends on the different various facets or sides of the industry, whether it be, folks at the railroads, whether it be Class 1 or short line, or folks that are at terminals, or folks that are at leasing companies, everybody, all pretty much had the same complaint: was there was a lack of visibility and transparency to be able to identify these different sort of service providers and assets. And so to me, the light bulb went off in 2014 and 15 that at some point somebody needed to create a platform, or was going to create a platform that connected all these rail server locations. Because, when you think about trucking, load boards have historically been around. Ocean freight, very, very liquid, very visible market. Barging, obviously, not so much, very opaque market similar to rail. But at some point, when you think about what's moving on rail, we got to make it, my thought was there has to be an easier way to be able to move freight on the one or two different modes of transportation by land, right?
Couldn't be any harder.
Couldn't be any harder.
It's only up from here.
Yeah, so that was the real sort of genesis behind the idea was, number one is, how do you take all these fragmented and disparate locations and put them into one virtual sort of, or digital ecosystem, effectively creating almost kind of a virtual railroad, which, when you have an industry that's been around so long, you have all these different locations, but no one's brought visibility to it, number one. Number two, if you're thinking about the future down the road and thinking about really where the value of a digital ecosystem plays is really two things. It's going to be the ability to be able to connect the supply and the demand sides of the industry, number one. And the ability to, number two, is be able to connect all the dots through data, which will provide insights, which eventually will provide more capabilities for people to be able to move freight, in theory, in a smarter and more effective and efficient way. Back in 2015, you're looking fast forward to now, and you thought about sort of artificial intelligence and what do you need in order to really power artificial intelligence? You really need two things, right? You need compute and power, number one, and then you need data, number two. To me, rail is sitting on a treasure trove of data because of all the different sort of everything from the CLM, ETA, weighable data, data. I mean, there's just so much data that is sitting within the rail system, but it's so untapped, and no one was taking and synthesizing all those different data points to be able to create a very clear picture of how different freight can be moved. So that was the concept behind Commtrex, was how do we create this sort of digital platform that connects all the different service providers. So we started first with a railcar storage marketplace and a railcar leasing marketplace. The very simplistic view was, in a bull market, leasing would always do well. In a bear market, storage would do well. And when you think about startups and building a company, and particularly sort of older industries, you always want to figure out sort of where you can add value on the peripheral, on the outside, and work yourself in, versus going right after sort of what you may believe is the true problem to solve. So for me, the idea was, well, if I can start connecting the dots with the short lines across North America, there's only 600 short lines. At least it's a very defined market. And Class 2s and Class 3s play a very integral role in being able to support shippers moving freight, particularly on the carload side of the business. I thought that would be a great place to start, because short lines are always very open to new ideas, and they're open to any sort of support or help they can get to grow their volume in their business, versus starting with the Class 1 railroads and going to the Class 1 railroads and saying, hey, I have a great solution for you. Let's start with the Class 2s and Class 3s. And then on the other side of that was trying to get as much rail equipment on as possible. And I started with the subleasing market, which was because I was in the coal market, I knew all the utilities, and by volume, coal moves more than anything else. So I went to all the friends that I had in the coal side of the business and said, hey, would you put your cars onto sublease? Would you store your cars on the system? So, by default, I had a kind of a pre-installed user base of, luckily, one of the largest bike volume commodities that move on rail, which is coal. So I had a very coal-centric platform to begin with, and then eventually I had to sort of move out of that. So we went from storage and leasing. Then we sort of, there was a lot of coal units that were being retired. So my friends in coal were coming to me saying, can you help us scrap all these cars? So we built a marketplace for, effectively used rail equipment to buy and sell. And then eventually moved to transloading. And once we sort of, moved into transloading, that was really where our focus shifted for pretty much the last 4 or 5 years. And timing-wise, it really sort of coincided with the beginning of the pandemic. We launched transloading at the end of 2019. The pandemic came around, at the end of first quarter of 2020, and our transload marketplace was probably 3 to 4 months old. And one of the things we optimized for was to be number one on Google, which we're number one on Google in over 2,000 cities in North America. So when capacity started getting tight at all the major ports, what do people do is they go to Google and they type in, transloading terminals, ports, and whatever city it may be, and people were looking for secondary and tertiary ports to be able to move their containers and their capacity to. So we were the one place that existed that connected all the dots. So timing wise, that did accelerate our growth, and that accelerated our ability to get more shippers onto the system, and then also sort of made it much easier for people to get more of the supply side onto the system. And so today, transloading has been really become our main focus, because it's the one thing that ties all the modes of transportation together. And when thinking about where do you sort of add the most value, or as a platform, where we add the most value, it's in really being able to help shippers think about how can they move more freight by rail. Because if you're a shipper moving primarily freight by truck, and you got caught off guard during the pandemic and you want a little bit more flexibility or resilience in your supply chain, you should probably think about diversifying and maybe moving 20-25% of your freight over to rail, at minimum, just to have some optionality.
Sure.
Or to hedge.
So I want to double click a little bit on something that I don't think in my own mind, I really put all the dots together. So you roll this thing out just a matter of months before a worldwide shutdown.
Yeah.
What's going through your head just right? Let's just chase that rabbit for a moment. Small business owner going out on your own for the first time, moving into the transportation space, and really in 2019, things aren't going well in the transportation space. You've got a freight recession, as we called it in 2019, a solid 4 quarters of negative growth there. You're rolling this thing out, and then the whole world shuts down. How surprising was it to you that this actually ended up being a tailwind for your platform?
The first reaction as a founder of an investor-backed startup was, what happens if capital markets dry up and I'm not able to raise more capital to be able to continue to build? Every tech startup has a roadmap, 1-2 years out, and you're executing quarter by quarter. And obviously you got to be a little bit flexible in how you're moving, but no one anticipates a global pandemic to shut the entire world down. It's not like it happened over a long period of time. It happened over a few months. what was going through my head was first, capital-wise, what do you do to be able to go find additional capital if you need to be able to effectively add more capital to the balance sheet to keep growing, number one. And number two, strategically, how do you navigate in this new environment? And it was very clear to me that what we were building with Translate, it took about 9 months for us to really sort of build out the marketplace, 3 or 4 months of user journey, 3 to 4 months of sort of mapping out the functionality and features. And this isn't something that has been done before. So you really had to understand the nuances of transloading. And transloading, is quite diverse in what it can do. Well, on the carload side, just by nature, there's over 12,000 commodities or 12,000 stick codes. So think about all the different types of equipments and permits and different sort of ways you can move freight. And then you have the whole container side of the business, which is completely different. So that was number one. And number two was, oh my God, this is actually going to be a value. There's actually some tailwinds here for us. So how do you capitalize on this real demand for people to find new capacity and be able to do it in a way that really is supportive to shippers trying to find new capacity while also providing sort of a way for the transloaders and terminals and ports to be able to find the demand? Because at the end of the day, this is no different than any other marketplace, right? So marketplace is either going to be supply side driven or demand side driven. In our industry, shippers are the demand side, and shippers drive everything in logistics. If you have a strategy, you have to make sure it aligns with the demand side. And demand side of our system is completely free. So since day one, we always knew we wanted to create very low friction for demand side to jump onto the system and utilize it. So we've never monetized the demand side. It's always been about the supply side, and the supply side subsidizing the demand side has been able to be able to, now we have over 2,500 shipping companies that use our system. We've never invested a dollar into really user acquisition. We've never advertised. Everything has really been organic and through referrals and marketing at some conferences, and really thought leadership and content has been a way we've been trying to get out there and educate shippers. But I would say that's probably the second thing that came up with the pandemic is, wow, now we're actually adding value, and it's very clear what the value prop is for us is providing visibility and connectivity. And what my next sort of idea was, how do you take that, and then now that you're moving into a world where AI is becoming more ubiquitous and pervasive, now you have to kind of reimagine what you think the future of logistics is going to be like. So that's the hardest part to me of being an entrepreneur is you have to build for the future while building for today. Now, with AI moving so fast, I don't know what 6 months, 12 months, what AI is going to look like. I mean, even, every week by week, ChatGPT or Perplexity or Cloud, they're adding new features and functionality that even 3 months ago, you wouldn't have imagined they'd been able to build. So everything that we built before, at minimum, everything we did was all about to try to aggregate as much data and information on the supply side as possible, because at the end of the day, that information is what fuels the visibility and the information that's going to help shippers make a better decision as to how can they convert some truckloads to rail loads across their supply chain.
So when you think about your target demographic of your platform, initially it was started out, basically you were targeting you. Just 10 years prior. You're thinking about yourself and what would have been so much easier if you'd had access to a Commtrex at the time. And of course, you're thinking about, and even the way that you talk, and sometimes you and I talk outside of something like this, and you can tell we've been in the industry for a long time. So all the words that we're using makes a lot of sense to us. But the reality is, even as I'm sitting here listening to you, I'm thinking about there's a portion of your clientele that's just like you and me. We are entrenched in supply chain. We have at least a tertiary knowledge of what rail does, how it works, and we're coming to Commtrex to say, please help me find an alternative port. It's a capacity play. It's a reducing friction play. And there's all types of things there for those of us who've been in the supply chain. But there's also, and probably people listening to this podcast even today, there are a lot of individuals who don't know a lot about rail. They don't know a lot about how do you even get into rail and what do the railroads do and all that type of thing. But they are very aware of 2021 and what that did to them, where you had 50% tender rejections in the truck market. And if you were moving reefer freight, it was 75% tender rejections. They're fully aware of the pain of this whipsaw of capacity in the trucking market. Is there an opportunity for those folks as well? When you are building this platform, are you also building it to help folks that know nothing about the rail?
It's a great question. To answer that question, let me back up and let me talk about the investment thesis behind the concept when we started this business. There were two primary investment thesis drivers for us when we started the business. And this is what, when I was articulating the vision to our investors, this is what I was sort of explaining. Number one was the demographic shift. By 2025, which is today, 75% of the global workforce will be millennials. Now, millennials are very different than baby boomers and different than Gen Xers. So by the time you have sort of, now you're sitting at 2025, you have baby boomers sort of moving out to the retirement. Gen X is a very, very small generation squeezed in between millennials and baby boomers. But once you get to 2025, you really now have your first generation of digital natives. And these are people that grew up with iPads and iPhones, and technology was the first thing in their mind when they're thinking about solving a problem. So if that is the demographic that's going to be the majority of the workforce, quite frankly, we need to build tools and have information at their fingertips that can help them make decisions the way they're used to making decisions, which is taking a bunch of data points, analyzing it, looking at their options, and then being able to execute based upon those decisions. Very, very different than historically, where you grew up in the industry, you had your relationships, you had your networking events, and you were calling your buddy at the railroad and they were giving you some pricing. You're like, okay, great. Well, the pricing works out. Let's do it. The next generation just functions differently. And back in 2016, 17, when I started this business, that's exactly what I was building for. So that was number one. Investment thesis number one was you have this demographic shift, whether industries want to or not, they're going to force change. And there's other behavior patterns as well that sort of move into that, which is how long millennials stay in a job is 2 to 3 years, and how they think about the first thing they do when they want to solve a problem. Historically is Google. Maybe that's now going to shift over to ChatGPT and other AI platforms. And then number two was really data. And back then, I knew that you had to be able to create a very, structured and thoughtful way of collecting data and content to be able to do two things. Number one, to be able to educate the next generation of shippers about rail through thought leadership, through courses. So we created this thing called the Resources Center, and we started out with Rail 101s. And so we created Rail 101 for transloading, for storage, for leasing, for rail services, for warehousing. And then we created this thing called Ask the Experts, which to me was at the very beginning of 5 or 6 years ago, was how do you take all of this intellectual property and knowledge that has been collected over these several decades and then take that corpus of knowledge and put it into a digital platform so that one day you can effectively create almost a super hyper intelligent sort of AI brain that can synthesize and take the knowledge that has been accumulated over these past decades and then help synthesize it for the next generation of shippers. And in order to do that, no one really sort of created, for lack of a better word, a time capsule of this information. And succession planning also was one of the reasons why I started this business, because I interviewed about 7 to 8 different shippers before I even raised my first dollar of capital. And I said, how are you thinking about succession planning? And what was very clear is on the shipper side of the business, succession planning wasn't something that was top of mind. And if that was the case and all of this sort of brain power and knowledge was moving out, to me, it was a very obvious thing that someone had to create this repository of information so that this knowledge and information could live on past the generation of people that had sort of effectively built the industry. So those were the two things that were really sort of at the core of our idea. Now, did I realize that AI would come on so strong and so fast and heavy? No, I didn't, but I knew that eventually AI was going to be a part of the platform solution. That's exactly right. Back then, the idea was let's launch a newsletter. So we launched our first newsletter in 2019, and let's create user-generated content, and let's go out to the market, have shippers ask questions about what they want to learn about, and let's go out to all their subject matter experts and ask them to answer the questions. So, since 2019, we've created, several thousand pages of content information, laying the foundation to be able to feed that into a large language model and sort of an AI brain.
What do you think has been the impact on rail to the fact that we were talking about this shifting demographic, which as you talked about, you've got different habits and different approaches and how the millennials approach work, how they approach exploring alternative solutions to their problems. And it's very, like you said, it was Google at first, and it moves into more of a chat world, and it's going to move into AI as we see this progress versus how the baby boomers and the Gen Xers, they approach this. But over time, there's also this just reality, so I'm double clicking a little bit on what you said there. There's been a lot of retirements going on as this knowledge has been leaving the industry of how to rely on rail. And no doubt, as you and I were growing up in the industry, having multimodal expertise and at your fingertips, you could call that buddy at the railroad, say, hey, truck didn't show up. I've got 6 truckloads worth of freight sitting. I've got a rail served dock here. Hey, let's see if we can get a boxcar in here in the next couple of days. that wasn't an unusual conversation back then. Now that that knowledge and experience and those relationships have left the industry, what's been the impact on rail from your perspective, what you've seen?
This isn't just for rail, but I think for any industry that's undergone that transformation, you go through from a very relationship-driven process to a very transaction-oriented process. You go from who do I know and who do I trust and who do I think, could do the best job to who do I think can provide the best price. And economics has always been an important part of the decision-making process when you're like piecing together that delivered cost. But I think, if it was apples to apples, and my boss used to always say, your job is to win the tip ball, and a lot of times in business, particularly in transportation, it's really who's going to win that tip ball. And typically the tip ball is going to go to the relationship. If that's the case, what happens in a world where relationships aren't as key? And that's the beauty of AI is a lot of the time that's spent on the commercial side, on the administrative processes, on the operational processes, just entering data into a CRM system, doing analytics. If you can apply AI to be able to solve those problems, what you do is you free up time for those commercial team members to go focus on the higher EQ work and focus on that relationship building. Because I think in a new world where digital first and then relationship second, there's going to be a lot more concerted effort that has to be invested into that relationship than before, because the generation that we're moving into now wants to be home by 5 o'clock. They don't want to be out at conferences or going to the Masters or the NBA championship. They don't want to be doing that as much because the priorities are different. And so if that's the case, then you have to be, as a commercial person, you have to be a lot more thoughtful about how you're spending your time. And that's where I think AI can be interjected and really sort of can pick up the slack or really sort of automate a lot of those workflows for the commercial people to focus on, number one. And number two, on the shipper side of the business, I think it also behooves them to be able to still continue to build those relationships. Now, the average amount of time that a millennial stays in a job, they say, is about 2 to 3 years. And if you believe that statistic is true, the obvious thing is, well, how are they ever going to build relationships if they're moving from job to job or from role to role? Number one, how are they going to build those long-term relationships, right? And number two, if they aren't going to be in those roles that long and they aren't going to have that sort of long-term tribal knowledge and that long-term relationships, how do you still create a very effective and efficient sort of supply chain program when it's no longer relationships driving everything and it's more information and data and algorithms that are supporting the decision making? So that's why, I think where we sit today, relationships are going to have to be, there's going to have to be more investments into it because you're just of a generation that thinks about it or functions differently under that dynamic. But at the same time, that's where AI steps in. And that's what I'm super excited about is how AI can really sort of jump into all these different aspects of commercial operations, back office, mid office, and really sort of free up time for humans to focus on problem solving, strategizing, higher EQ relationship work. Really, to me, the things that today AI can't replicate and the things that don't, really is unique to humans.
Right. So describing the problem that we're seeing here and that Commtrex is definitely trying to tackle, you have all of these headwinds really to the supply chain industry overall, and maybe felt even more on the rail side, and get to that here in a moment, just circling back to what you were saying earlier. But the reality is, with all of that knowledge has left the building, if you will, in the industry, knowledge of barge, knowledge of rail, really the easy button, because it's become transactional, has become truck. And despite what's been going on here recently, the reality is that truck continues to grow. And that's problematic because as these shifts come back and forth, the pendulum swings from a capacity standpoint, you have shippers that get hung out to dry because their truckers aren't showing up. There's 3 to 1, 2 to 1 for every available trailer. And if they're used to hitting that easy button, it might be working right now, but it didn't work in 2021 very well. It wasn't working in 2022. It didn't work in 2018 very well. And as you think about the long-term trajectory of the trucking industry itself, whether you argue right now that there's a driver shortage or not, everybody admits that there will be over time. So continue to hit the easy button, because I don't know how to hit any other button. And that's really where it seems like Commtrex is trying to step into. Folks like you and me, we can use Commtrex for sure. We know how to use it. Specifically, how does it work? So if you're a new user to Commtrex, how does it work? I've got an opportunity to move something from where it is to where it needs to be. How does Commtrex work?
The typical workflow for a shipper is, most shippers, just as they are in their personal life, they'll typically start at the Google toolbar. And then they'll go to the toolbar and they'll type in, I need transloading, warehousing, terminals, ports, and then they'll type in the city. So, call it Charleston, Mobile, Atlanta, Houston, whatever the city is. because Commtrex is organic position number 1 in over 2,000 cities, Commtrex is going to be the first that's going to typically be the first link they see. So it'll say, for example, 30 top translators in Houston. So they'll click into that link and then they'll be able to see a whole list of translators, terminals, ports, warehouses that are in that area. And what we effectively did is we just organized a bunch of information and data that wasn't readily available before. So we take all that information, we take all of our subscribers. There's 2 different categories of subscribers. There's a featured and a verified. And just as you would think in a directory, we create a profile page that has all this different information on each particular facility. So everything from how many days it's served by rail, what type of transloading equipment does it have, safety features, what type of services, do you have outdoor, indoor storage, and there's a whole profile that the location can put on about themselves. But very, very fundamental marketing advertising 101 is if your customer can't find you, you're not going to get that business. So if you believe that sort of very basic core tenet of marketing is the case, our job is to kind of get these particular translators, terminals, and ports and warehouses in front of these shippers as quick and as easy as possible, number one. And quite frankly, when you think about sort of, all the different industries that exist, this industry isn't one that has invested heavily into digital marketing or digital strategy. So
that's right.
You chuckle because that's probably an understatement. But I think people realize, because historically, if you think about transloading as an industry or just terminals, ports, and warehouses, you're really capturing business that is moving within 150 miles of that area. And, you probably have maybe, 10, 15, 20 customers, and Pareto's principle, 20% of those customers are 80% of your volume. So long as that capacity is moving, you're probably sitting fairly well. But what happens in a world where you don't have that same sort of luxury of a shipper being that dedicated to that specific region? And instead of focusing on one region, now they're taking their supply chain and spreading, instead of having 3 or 4 hubs across the country, now they have 20 different mini hubs. So that capacity that they used to use your location for, 40%, 50% of their business in the South is now 10% because now they're diversifying their mix and they're trying to create some flexibility and sort of resilience in their supply chain. Now, all of a sudden, your capacity opens up and you have to figure out a way to go find new business, and you have to be a little bit more innovative about how you get people's attention. So if you believe all that's the case, then that's where our platform comes into place, because you list your location on our platform. We create a very easy way for shippers to find you. And then once the location is found and a shipper wants to either connect with you, or a shipper just wants to sort of go to a city page and then find a location that matches them, letting an algorithm run, the shippers will then fill out what we call a transload request. And a transload request is going to be about 11 different data points. So it's going to be origin, destination. Are you moving containers? Are you moving commodities? Then we have a stick code finder. And then what's the volume? What's the term? What specialty requirements do you have? Do you need trucking? Do you need warehousing? All the basic high-level commercial parameters that you'd want to know as a...
And once again, this is free for the shippers.
It's 100% free for the shippers.
They come in, they can fill out 11 questions that hopefully, I assume, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the questions that are being asked could be answered by anybody. You definitely don't have to be a rail expert, for instance.
No. As long as you know where your product is starting and where it's going, what the volume is, what exactly it is. Usually you have a safety data sheet that can spell out exactly what that 7-digit stick code is. As long as you know the basic parameters of what you want to do, that's good enough to be able to start the conversation with the translator. Now, and I always say we're Match.com. We're not eHarmony or Tinder. That probably dates me, the fact I'm saying those things. But for Match.com, for initially rail, but now sort of more sort of landside logistics, our goal is to be able to connect the shipper with the supply side that can help manage their movement. But we don't intermediate it. We're not a 3PL. We're not an exchange to where we have a standardized contract and everything flows through our marketplace. Our goal is to be able to get the shipper and the supply side to match up. After the sort of basic few correspondences, then they take it offline and execute a contract together. And I think that was one of the reasons why I was able to get so much adoption in the industry so quickly, is because they viewed us as a matchmaker versus, a broker or an intermediary. Historically, if you're a broker or if you're a 3PL, you're typically not allowing the supply side to know who your shipper is. You're giving all the details and facts of what they want to move without telling the supply side who the shipper is. We're the opposite. Once you connect with the once a shipper connects to the translator, we want that sort of shipper to disclose who they are to the translator or to the provider, the short line, the warehouse, the Class 1 railroad. And you want that sort of information flow to happen so that the translators or the short or the supply side quickly knows, A, is this a new customer to rail? B, is this an existing customer? C, do they already move by rail or are they new move by rail? Just those very basic details are very helpful. So some of the questions we ask when you're a member are, have you ever moved by rail before? If not, do you have existing rail contracts? Do you have rail cars in your fleet? When you fill out a membership profile, we're trying to capture all the basic details of who you are as a shipper. How big is your fleet? What type of cars do you have in your fleet? If you don't know the answer to this question, you can still register. But the more information you give the system, the better the match. That's exactly right. So, in order for a marketplace to function, you need to effectively clean, high integrity data on the supply side so the shipper knows what they're looking for. And then conversely, you need that on the shipper side so that as the algorithm is getting smarter over time, and this is even pre-AI, you can match up the shipper and their needs and services much better with who they're looking for on the service provider side. Very difficult business model. Marketplaces are probably one of the hardest models. Anybody who asks me, hey, I want to start a marketplace for insert the industry, I typically dissuade them to do it because I think having one customer is hard, but think about having two customers that have two completely different, motives and objectives. And then you also have to think about, creating functions and features that can service both, and you're constantly updating these features and functions to create a very fluid technology. But if you can nail the marketplace model, you've got an amazing business because then, if you think about the 10 largest tech companies in the world, 7 or 8 of those 10 companies are marketplace businesses. Think about Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon. These are all marketplaces. And why are they so critical to the industries that they serve? It's because it's extremely difficult to bring the supply and demand side into one digital ecosystem and get them to use that as their sort of first place to go to for whatever service or product they're looking for. And that's been sort of the North Star for us this whole time is how do you create easy enough functionality to where someone who doesn't know how to move by rail can jump into the system. And if they want to learn about rail, you have Rail 101s, you have Resources Center, you have Ask the Experts, you have all these different sort of topics that can help inform the ship. Because at the end of the day, nobody's going to move freight by rail if they don't understand it, because they're going to have to go to their boss and their boss's boss to say, hey, listen, that 20% of our freight that's currently moving all by truck, we want to actually shift that over by rail. And things like accessorials and demurrage, and all these different fees that sort of pop up.
Yeah, that plethora of words that are unique to this industry for sure. Let's double click on that right there. There's an assumption in basically our entire conversation to this point that when they went to Google and Commtrex came up, that as they drilled down in this, now you're expanding well beyond rail at this point too, but if a rail solution is the underlying solution that Commtrex is building, how does a shipper know that their type of freight is potentially a good fit for rail? So as Commtrex comes up, I'm logging in there, I'm starting to fill out this form. Maybe I don't even fill out the form because I just assume rail's not a good fit for me because I don't know anything about it. So from your perspective, what makes a good rail shipper?
It's a very loaded question. I'm going to answer the first part of that question. So the first part of the question, how do they know that their freight or their product is appropriate for rail? I don't think you know that unless you go through the discovery process. Obviously, there's very sort of easy eliminators, right? A, do you have the volume to justify moving by rail, right? Do you have enough to, I'm talking carload side of that business, not intermodal.
Because rail works best with bulk.
That's exactly right. Historically, we focused more on the carload side, and then we started moving more into the container and intermodal side of the business with transloading. But that's exactly right. Do you have enough volume? And then B, let's just be quite frank, do you have the balance sheet to support the credit that's needed to get the Class 1 railroad to move for you? I can pick up the phone tomorrow and call any 3PL or any broker and move product from Chicago to LA in 2 seconds without a heavy credit background check. Moving rail, there's a fairly stringent and scrutinizing background check that happens or balance sheet sort of that they're looking at. So, A, volume, B, do you have the balance sheet? And C, and to me, this is kind of the more nuancing is, do you have the expertise to understand all the nuances of rail, right? How do you source the equipment? How do you bill out a car? How do you manage accessorials or demurrage fees? How do you negotiate a freight rate? How do you negotiate a transload rate? How do you enter into a contract with a leasing company? How do you manage a 3-year leasing contract? How do you manage a fleet? And I say all these things because those are all real topics that people have to think about when they're moving freight by rail. Now, if they're using system cars and they're moving, a very fungible commodity like grain, and it's fairly straightforward, I don't think there's as much complexity to it. But if you're moving hazardous liquid and there's environmental permits and there's special types of rail equipment that you need, and there's a special type of transloader you need that can handle equipment, and then you need to understand what happens if for some reason there's a spill or there's some sort of accident. There's all these contingencies that you have to think about depending upon what the product is. And so my first answer was discovery. I think you really have to sort of go through that process of piecing together what that supply chain is like. I don't think it's as easy as, oh, well, I have lumber, so I'm going to move it because I know lumber moves easily by rail. I think you really have to think about what your origin point is, what your destination point is, what your time requirements are, who are your customers, how does it change your business model? But I don't think that all those things are hard to figure out if you know where to go to be able to get those answers. Class 1 railroads, short line railroads, transloaders, lessors, everybody in the rail ecosystem wants you to be successful. Everybody wants you to move more freight by rail. So everyone's going to try their best to help you out. Now, some people will have more time than others to be able to train you. And unlike intermodal, there's not ubiquitous 3PL on the commodity side of the business that can handle all types of commodities, right? It's very specialized and very unique. There is a bit of navigating you have to do, but hence that's where interject Commtrex, our job is to be able to help sort of make those connections for you at minimum for you to be able to go through that discovery process and start and have the conversation. I think that's where the very first step is how do I have the conversation and how do I at the very least get all the inputs to be able to put into my model, whether just on economics alone, just on straight up economics, does it make sense? Is rail at least flat to truck? And even if it's a bit of a premium over truck, can you justify it as a hedge against any sort of disruption on the trucking side of the business? And I think for most cases, people can justify at the very least testing it out for at least a year with some small percentage of their freight. And if it works, then they sort of incrementally will sort of move more and more freight over. But if you have the balance sheet, you have the volume, you have the desire to learn, and your management is supportive of you sort of taking some risk, nothing is risk-free, right? It's called risk reward for a reason, right? So if you're going to take a risk on moving to another mode, you just have to build in some buffer and cushion for accessorials or other issues to come up. But whatever you may lose in that buffer, you're probably going to gain on the other side through flexibility, resilience, optionality, and through potentially sort of finding routes that you may not have access to before through translators or other sort of third parties that can help you create more sort of solutions to look at versus, hey, well, where are we going to move this over the road?
Yeah. If I were to answer that question too, I would just add on to that. I mean, you just think about the different modes, even within rail. You have intermodal. It's the most truck-like service that you're going to find. It's a natural progression out of truck into rail to dip your toe in rail. And the carrier network or the IMCs that work in that space, the intermodal marketing companies, they will hold your hand in a lot of ways. And your platform helps even in that space now. You're in the container space as well. You get into the carload space, it gets into a lot of the things that Martin and I are talking about here, where these accessorials and emerge and things like that. You'll have some of that in the trucking space. You're familiar with accessorials in the trucking space too, but it's a bit more nuanced in the rail space. But you have these conversations with the transloader. You have the conversation, they may make an introduction to a rail-centric 3PL. Anyway, the discussion happens, have the discussion, but likely, the intermodal space, think anything that's going to be palletized is going to move well in the intermodal space. And they have expedited intermodal, they've got standard intermodal, and, the expedited space, it can be it's going to be single driver competitive, not usually team truck competitive, but it's going to be somewhere in between there. In the boxcar space, still a lot of palletized freight, but anything that's bulk is probably something you ought to be thinking through, right, Martin?
That's exactly right.
And anything that, if you've got 3 or 4 truckloads that you're releasing especially on a daily basis, there's probably an opportunity to explore a transload model. And by transload, of course, what we mean by that is if you're not currently rail served, there's probably a location near you where you could dray a small distance and have the transloader unload the truck and put it onto a rail car of some type and do the same thing on the other end. Now, that's additional touches, additional costs, but to Martin's point, you have an expectation that the railroads understand that. So they're going to try to price that as effectively as they can, and they get the economics of bulk as well on their end. The message I think for Martin and I today for sure is that there's an opportunity to have a conversation. And if you are moving anything that's bulk related at all, you should definitely be thinking about rail. And a great place to make those introductions, if you don't know anybody in the rail industry, a great place to find someone in the rail industry is to come to Commtrex. Now let's talk a little bit about outside of rail, though. You've got 2.0 here. I assume your clients have requested you to move maybe in this broader direction, but talk a little bit about that, Martin.
When we started the business, really the business objective was to be able to find an easy way to connect the supply and demand side. And 8 years ago, that was through creating a very structured directory. And the directory was exactly what I explained, right? You find a city, then you find the locations of that city, and then answer some question, algorithm runs, and it matches you up. Now, if you ask me what is the future of logistics and where is that headed? And I'm not going to even just say logistics. I'm going to say the future of most industries or every industry down the road. I'm going to use the analogy of what you're seeing in human resources today. Historically, whenever you wanted to find a job, you would be building a resume and a cover letter for that human resources coordinator to be able to evaluate it and then be able to pass you along and get you, at the very least, to that first interview. Nowadays, if you're looking for a job, you're not building a resume and cover letter for a human. You're building it for an AI algorithm, whether it be on LinkedIn or whether it be, submitting it directly to the company. AI is probably filtering out, at least at the Fortune 500 companies and most large companies, AI is probably filtering out 80, 90% of all the resumes. So now, as a human, you're not thinking about what is the human sort of component that I need to think about. Now you're thinking about what are those key words that I need to do to filter, to get past that to get to that first interview. Now let's think about, why are companies using an AI algorithm to be able to use as a filter? Well, they're doing it because they're taking all the different inputs that a human would, and they're saying we can train an AI algorithm to be able to do the same thing as a human, but at a much larger scale and much faster. And we can do it to also ingest a lot more data points, not just the resume and cover letter, not just, maybe some LinkedIn profile information, but you can ingest all these other data points that could help you make a much more informed decision. So I use that analogy because that is, to me, one of the sort of first frontiers where humans are now marketing to an AI agent or an AI algorithm at scale. So if you believe that sort of that same sort of mental model of all these data points are being ingested and we've trained an algorithm to be able to filter out for, all these different roles, why wouldn't you think that that same exact mental model will apply to other industries and other facets of that company? Let's just play this out a little bit. Let's just say that same model moves into supply chain. And let's just say Fortune 500 companies start to integrate different parts of their procurement process and using AI agents or AI workflows to be able to procure different products or different services. Now, as a service provider, you're doing the same thing as a job applicant. Now you're saying, okay, now I don't have to sort of think about how do I market to the human that sits in those seats. Now you're talking about a procurement AI agent. That's exactly right. So if you believe that that is the natural evolution and everything is going to be driven, and like I said, everything is driven by demand side, and Fortune 500 companies are already doing it in their human resources department, why wouldn't you think Fortune 500 companies wouldn't start moving that exact same model to all the other departments within their company? So if you're plodding along with me and you think that that's the case, it's only a matter of time for that same model to hit procurement. So if that same model hits procurement, then as a service provider in supply chain logistics, now you have to think about, well, how do I now market my service when it's not to a human that I meet at a conference or a human that I show up to the door, knock on the door?
It's
or
a keyword, gatekeeper.
A gatekeeper. And now when the gatekeeper is an algorithm versus a human, now the whole way you think about your business has to change because the way you market and sell and your strategy commercially has to change. So I say all that to be because as we're trying to build this virtual ecosystem, we're trying to sort of match supply and demand side. As the CEO of a company thinking about where the future is, I believe that the future is going to be initially agents will seep into the demand side in different parts of the procurement process. And then on the supply side, there's going to start to be a sort of a slow sort of assimilation in everything from, I'm not just talking logistics, I'm talking everything from procuring pencils to toilet paper to services. You're going to start to think about, okay, how do I now sort of sell to this company that isn't using a human to make the decisions, but is using an AI agent to do it? So, fast forward to Commtrex, we're trying to piece together exactly in a marketplace where there potentially are agents that are making procurement decisions. How do you now help service providers market to those agents? And that is part of Commtrex 2.0. How do you take all the data that we're ingesting and capturing and create a much more strategic way for the supply side to actively sort of market to the shippers? And then also, how do you help shippers in a world where they're leveraging AI to be able to find those right service providers? But all of that relies on data, and that's what we're collecting at scale is data.
So the value for the shippers, especially, because I definitely can understand the value to the supplier of the services, but you want the absolute best match for the shipper, and that's an opportunity for AI. as long as you have a human being thinking as human beings do in a million different ways. But an AI could take the data and just, frankly, in some ways be smarter than I am if I'm performing the procurement process from end to end. So introducing AI, as we expect they're going to do, you and I both do, on the procurement side, and matching that capability on the vendor side, just make sure that they're getting the right match. Everybody's matching with as close to a perfect match as possible. And that's going to be incredibly valuable to the supply chain, because there's no doubt, even from as a supplier, I'm a vendor. That's what my company does. There's a lot of wasted conversations that we have, and I only have so many salespeople. And if they're out there having conversations with potential customer and we're not a good match, we just wasted everybody's time there. So that's a very interesting concept, Martin, where you all are headed. And frankly, I've not heard anybody else talk like that yet. So very excited to see where Commtrex goes. Martin, we are out of time. That was fast. That was a lot of fun. So thankful for you, Martin. You are a true problem solver, and I'm thankful for people like you out in the industry that are seeing the problems that we have, seeing the demographic shifts, seeing the changes and from a relationship-driven model to a transactional model, and everybody's doing more with less. We need solutions like what you're providing. So thank you very much for what you do. Martin, thanks for coming on the show today. And for all of those of you who are listening in, you're serving in the supply chain, we salute you. We know that we have a little idea what you're facing every day, and it's a challenge, but we appreciate what you do. You are all problem solvers, and we just encourage you to keep on going on. Keep on, what am I trying to say, Martin? Keep on going. We'll get it here, but keep going. We're counting on you. The United States needs you. The North America needs you, and the worldwide global supply chain needs you. And we appreciate you very much. So thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Ben.